So today's session is on NIMBYism versus YIMBYism and the big old question of whether or not we should bulldoze the planning system, which is one that is pretty intense at the moment. Next slide, please, Domi. So broadly speaking, today's aims are just to do a bit of shared learning on the current debate from myself. So I'm, for those of you that don't know me, I'm a researcher that works on the financialization of land and housing and regional inequality at NEF. So I'm going to talk to you a bit through kind of the history of the debate and where it's at now and who the key players are. Do a bit of myth busting around what the current debates are, and then talk about how we can start to build our case as an alliance, as the Homes for Us Alliance, but also as, you know, campaigners that are fighting for housing and equality, not inequality, on the left. A caveat, because it's always great to start any presentation with a caveat. These are, of course, slides written by me based on my background as an academic and a housing activist. They are by no means the be-all and end-all. I don't think I have the answers to all the questions, and I'm very keen to hear everyone else's thoughts. But as I said, we just wanted to put these resources together for everyone. Domi, next slide, please. Okay, so just briefly, quick context of kind of why we're here and why now and why we wanted to talk about this debate. So I'm sure it'll probably be news to no one that there's been a really rapid rise in the discussion of the NIMBY versus YIMBY wars in this country. They dominate a lot of the media. It's a key part in the current government and also the previous one, but particularly the Labour government, and how they're pushing the conversation on housing. There's been quite a rise in a distinction between types of housing campaigners that I would argue, and I know others have argued, that are used to both firstly divide us and secondly to distract us from other issues, which we'll come back to later. Of course, we know that the government declared in their manifesto that they were going to, quote, bulldoze the planning system as a means with which to, quote, fix the housing crisis. We're going to explore a bit about what that means. And I think it's always worth contextualizing these conversations. Of course, we're operating against the backdrop of kind of mass deregulation, which of course started in the 1980s under neoliberalism and a lot of what Thatcher brought in. But we've also seen, you know, the really, really shocking consequences of deregulation of developers and landlords in terms of destroying people's lives. Always point to Grenfell as kind of the most acute example of that, but there's many examples which I know everyone on the call today will have a lot of experience in. So it's really important for us to tool ourselves up against these debates, because I think one thing that I've found as both a researcher and an activist, and I know others have, is that we're constantly kind of met with the accusations of being a NIMBY, and that's kind of declared upon us and thrust upon us, and it's really difficult to move beyond that and really cut through that kind of quite propaganda-based argument to actually talk about what it is about the housing system that we're trying to fix and why deregulation as a tactic is not one that will lead us to genuine equality, genuinely affordable homes, accessibility, and other issues. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, so a very brief history. For any of you that know me, I could have written about 100,000 words on this. So this is a whistle-stop tour. So very brief history on the YIMBY movement. So for those of you that aren't familiar, YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. It came to the fore in the United States, particularly in San Francisco and California, as a response to kind of three broad things. The strengthening, of tenants movements is very much kind of where YIMBYism really took to the fore, as in opposition to tenants movements that were fighting for better regulation, that were fighting for better conditions, for issues like rent controls and other things. It also really gained strength around the 2008 crash and their subsequent affordability crisis. And we'll talk a bit more about their key arguments and why it's linked to quote unquote affordability, but does have a longer history in the 1980s and then kind of reached another peak in the 90s around regulation, deregulation arguments and density, and particularly urban development, so particularly over in the States, but has evolved over in the UK. So if you ask a YIMBY what they are, they will tell you that they are a pro-housing social movement, which I would argue probably all of us would say that we are. The premise of their support is based on building of all housing and total opposition to density limits So limits around kind of how many high rises can be built in a certain place, how many units can be built. And they claim that this is a means with which to tackle specifically the affordability crisis in cities. It's relatively speaking up until this point, and it's kind of shifted a bit, but I would still argue it's this. It's very much an urban movement in your kind of large, what would be called in academia, global cities. So kind of San Fran, New York, quite a big movement in Boston, in London, as we'll see in the UK, it's moved over here a lot. And what I really want to get to today is us to think about as a group what the consequence of advocating for these very orthodox economic policies are. So what they're really fighting for is wholesale deregulation of land use, expediting construction, so building of new housing. And really the bottom line is the intensification of the accumulation of finance from rental housing, because it's really important to say that the YIMBY movement, broadly speaking, are not fussy about the tenure and type of housing that they're advocating for, which we'll come on to. But it's really important to kind of remember those are the fundamentals of what YIMBYs base their argument on. And I will say, this is not me saying that as someone opposed to the movement. If you Google YIMBYs, they are very open and frank about this being what they're about and why they do it. And of course, they link that to what they claim will be a increase in affordability. But we'll have a look at some of the evidence against and around that. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, so kind of your key proponents of YIMBYism, and I'm very much generalizing here. As a sociologist, I would probably have my degrees taken off me for doing that, but we only have an hour, so I need to generalize. It's worth noting, I think, the interesting thing about the YIMBY movement, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this in the UK, particularly more so than the States, is that their supporters are now coming from across the political spectrum. You know, we've even now got kind of environmentalists who are looking to YIMBYism as to kind of encourage urban, like city-based development as opposed to development on green spaces. And there's a massive discourse around brownfield land, which is ex-industrial land, versus greyfield land and greenfield land being built on, because we know the government are pushing to build homes. So you have seen some people in the environmentalist movement move into the YIMBY space, not necessarily as a means to support deregulation, but as a means with which to try and move development, particularly housing development, away from green spaces. Ironically, there's kind of a Venn diagram at which GB News also call those people NIMBYs, but we can kind of get on to the complexities of that. Right-leaning think tanks have been probably the biggest proponent for YIMBYism, both in terms of the way in which they advocate for their arguments in research, but they've also been quite substantial financiers of YIMBY arguments, YIMBY kind of, what they call like collectives when they have conferences, lobby groups. Think tanks have occupied quite a significant space in that. And their main arguments center around dismantling the planning system and mass private house building as a key ask. The bigger groups that you probably see a lot in media, and we kind of come into, I'm sure others on the call have had this, I have in our activist groups, younger people who are unable to afford to buy housing in large cities, particularly in London. So we've seen a massive increase in campaign groups such as Priced Out, who very much kind of lean into or would recognize themselves and refer to themselves as YIMBYs. And huge increases as well in the Labour Party, often linked to growth, which of course is Labour's 2025 thing. But we've got Labour YIMBY Group and Labour Housing Group are very prominent. And if anyone had the displeasure of attending the Labour Party conference, you will have seen that a lot of these groups were quite prominent in a lot of the events and a lot of the socials. And there was a lot of conversation around kind of how their positions would be advocated for in this government, both now and moving forward. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, so the big question, who are the NIMBYs? Are they a folk devil? Are they a real concern? My argument, and this is half based on my experience, half based on my research. In my experience personally, anyone that opposes kind of the unfettered expansion of cities and housing, and when I say expansion of housing, I mean mass house building, is referred to as a NIMBY. I've been called one live on telly. I've been called one in kind of community meetings. I've been called one in workspaces. It's certainly become kind of a name with which to beat us, and has become really held up. And I use the word folk devil because the question is really my second bullet point, which is actually what we're asking for is not, we're not saying that people don't need homes. We're asking what type of house. So what's the size, what's the quality, what's the tenure, and where is it? So a lot of the arguments against kind of really pushing for wholesale mass increase of house building is that, of course, we risk ending up with food deserts, with service deserts, with, housing estates. For example, I'm based in Liverpool, and we had a massive increase in housing estates, kind of mid to late 20th century, and then some more recently. And a lot of the people that move into these housing estates, who have been on waiting lists for a long time, or who are kind of renting smaller, quote unquote, cheaper because it's further out of cities housing, are then stuck on estates that don't have any large supermarkets, right? So they're reliant on the Tesco Express that's 20% more expensive than the larger supermarket, or there's not access to public transport. There's not the infrastructure around these new developments. And that's a really big part that gets missed in what I would consider to be the false binary between the NIMBYs that are the bad people and the YIMBYs that just want everyone to have a house. It's not about saying that, we don't want people to have houses. It's about asking what those houses are, where they are, and who they're for. And then, of course, as well, the NIMBYs, the kind of classic one that people talk about is the middle class older person that lives in the home counties or in the southwest in a lovely village that doesn't want any house building or any people to move into their nice quaint villages, or they don't want them to expand, and they're often held up as NIMBYs. But as I said, there's an interesting intersection now around some people that are supporting the building in dense urban centres as a means with which, or with the hope, to move building out of green spaces. So there's an interesting dynamic there that's unfolding. Next slide, thanks, Tommy. Oh, I can't see my slides. There we go. Okay, so very whistle-stop tour, and don't worry, I'm not going to give a lecture on economics. But there's kind of two key arguments two key principles, arguments that uphold and underpin the YIMBY movement. So the first one is the market-based logics of supply and demand. And I'm sure any of you that have kind of had conversations around house building or rent controls or other issues have been batted down by the arguments of supply and demand that are often presented to us as very common sense arguments. And they're rooted in neoclassical economics. And the argument is at the most baseline is that by building more housing, which is the supply element, prices will naturally decrease, which is the demand element. And of course, the age-old question is, have we seen this? And research shows us, no matter what we're told, research does show us that overall, no. The best we've seen is that prices will slow down or could slow down, and that's not an inevitable. And there's a few reasons for this. Next slide, please, Tommy. So first reason is that the housing market is very different to other tradable goods, right? And tradable goods are the premise of the supply and demand argument, okay? So if we think like coffee or olive oil, for example, principally housing is different because it takes time to build it, to buy it, and to sell it. So to trade in it takes time. So the quote unquote increase in demand is not an immediate overnight increase, right? Now, one could argue, as we do at NEF, that if you were to say retrofit and reacquire all the empty homes, that could be an overnight dent made in the housing crisis. But that's not what the government and other proponents are talking about here. Of course, linked to the profit that can be made from it, which we'll come to. So the first point is that housing market is very different to other tradable goods that are used around this supply and demand argument. The second factor is that house prices are not just affected by one key issue. Multiple factors intersect to affect housing prices, whether that be access to transport, whether that be access to jobs, building materials, inflation prices. To isolate one of these is a very complex process. One would argue actually pretty much impossible to do. So then the argument that they have, which is the wholesale, well, if you build X more houses, then house prices and rents will fall dramatically. That's the argument there, is isolating the issue of house prices, which is not easily done, and I would argue not possible. The third factor, which it really pertains to the for the Alliance and for our work at NEF, is related to the private rented sector, which is that, as we know, there are currently no controls over what rent can be charged. And due to how acute the current crisis is, and I'm talking across the private rented sector, across temporary accommodation, across social housing, landlords know, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, that they don't have to decrease rents yet, if ever, if there's no, excuse me, if there's no controls put in by government, if there's no policy controls around rents. So this idea that rented prices would fall, well, that's dependent on landlords pulling them down. And we know that how long the waiting lists are, how acute the crisis is in housing. The idea that if we built, you know, I don't know, 90,000 homes tomorrow, well, that doesn't solve all the waiting lists. That doesn't solve all the people in temporary accommodation. So therefore, landlords are not going to decrease those rents because they don't need to quite yet. Now, perhaps they would in 10 years, in 20 years, but that's not the argument that proponents of house building are making. And then fourthly, also linked to that, but slightly different, is that we know that we've had decades of wage stagnation relative to house price increases. And if we were to look at that in terms of, it would take 25 years on average of absolutely no price increases to even get close to the affordability ratio that we need relative to wages right now. So the idea that house building in isolation of any other genuinely good changes around equality of wages and job security and precarity, those two issues are really, really separated in this argument, and they can't be, because you need your wages to at least be anywhere close to levels of house prices in order to make sure that there's an affordability ratio, which we're nowhere near now. And that conversation's always missed out of discussion. And I think it's just worth here as well reflecting on the fact that the only period in the UK's post-war history when new homes were being constructed at the rate that the Labour government are targeting now was in the 50s, between the 50s and 70s. Yeah, between the 50s and 70s. And around half of that stock was publicly funded. So this idea that, you know, a rapid increase in privately developed housing will have any impact on, firstly, the actual houses that are being built and also affordability is just a moot point. Of course, the government know that, and they've made it pretty clear that they're not going to do a mass social housing program. But it's important to kind of have these arguments at our disposal when we're going through these discussions. Okay, we're on the next slide. Cool. So the second key principle of the YIMBY movement, again, as they say themselves, I'm not ad-libbing for them, is that we need the wholesale deregulation of a planning system. So I'm sure lots of people have heard this conversation. I was on a call, on a panel the other day, and to my shock, there was quite a few kind of developers on there and house builders, and basically the entire conversation was around red tape and the hold up in planning permission being the cause of their not being built developments. And this is the most regularly kind of trotted out argument, and Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner have used this argument. Politicians use it all the time. So red tape's the first aspect of why they feel that we need to deregulate the planning system. And by deregulate the planning system, I mean they don't believe that democratic planning systems should exist. So it shouldn't be up to publicly appointed officials, whether that's civil servants or politicians, because local politicians sit on planning committees. The belief here is that that shouldn't be held in the public realm, because that just causes too much bureaucracy and too much red tape. The other aspect of this argument is that planning is out of touch with societal needs and modern global economies. So very much kind of tied to the growth aspect is the argument that kind of anything rooted in local government or democracy is out of touch and needs overhaul and bulldozing, as Starmer said it. And actually, in order to realize our potential, then we need to kind of lean into the private sector, be that public-private partnerships or wholly private sectors, which, of course, as we've seen since the 1980s, hasn't gone that well for our society. More broadly, the discourse positions public planning, as I've said, as kind of anti-development and anti-developer, which is an important distinction. Because, you know, being anti-developer is very different to being anti-development. So you can agree that we need public infrastructure developed whilst also agreeing that we shouldn't let private interests make unfettered profits from the homes in which we live. But it's always positioned in this argument as two of the same. And instead, as I said, instead of regulated planning, they want what's asked for is supply side policies to oversee a housing boom. And it's important to note, as I'm sure no one needs telling, that this housing boom is not in social and affordable homes. It's in market rate housing. And that's the other aspect of kind of myth busting their supply and demand argument. Why would a 6-bedroom house for a very wealthy family have an impact on a 1-bed social flat becoming available for someone that needs it? Of course it wouldn't. Okay, next slide, please, Domi. We're nearly there, by the way. I'm going to start talking in a minute. So a bit of myth busting on the deregulation of the planning aspect. Again, no surprise to anyone, I'm sure. It is not red tape that holds up planning decisions. It's public cuts. It's not that widely known, but planning departments were, I think, the second most affected by public cuts since 2010. Almost 50% of planning resources, and that's both staff, so planners and people that are qualified to make the decisions, and the financial resources that go into planning departments have been cut by almost half since 2010. I speak a lot to people that were previously public planners, and there was just a mass exodus to the private sector. And that's not good for multiple reasons. Firstly, because that means that they're able to kind of take the tools that they learn in the public sector and provide it to the private. But also, of course, if kind of the most experienced planners are leaving our public sectors for the private sector, that's inherently bad for kind of anyone that cares about public policy. The other kind of major myth was around planning being a blocker. Planning's not, and I'll come on to a bit why I believe that kind of the housing movement and the left more broadly should care deeply about planning. It is one of our only sources of protection for existing communities, for the environment, and for our future. Without strong planning systems, we can't hold developers to account. So I've mentioned here Section 106 agreements, which are agreements leveled against developers that build private developments. They have to give X amount of affordable housing in a system or, in a development, or a certain amount of money to infrastructure or education places. So if it's, for example, already quite a oversubscribed area, then the council are able to ask the developer to provide kind of an arbitrary figure, maybe like £2,000 per house for a contribution to educational institutions in order to help them grow. These contributions are not, of course, anti-developer. It's part of the system that they choose to exist in. They choose to reap X amount of profit from that system. Therefore, they have to hold up their end of the bargain. And without a strong planning system, we know that developers can't be held to account. I did some research on the impact in Liverpool on this, and you know, we were hitting 80% of our Section 106 agreements were just not collected. We're talking tens of millions of pounds of developer money not collected, and it wasn't because the council didn't want to collect it. It was because they didn't have the staff and the expertise to be able to do the paperwork that goes with that. And because developers have more resource, they can tie things up in legal disputes and other issues. So it's, you know, having a strong planning system is really important for that. And also these issues around kind of wanting to bulldoze the planning system because it's quote unquote anti-developer really does exemplify, we would argue at NEF, the reason why we need reform to kind of policies like land value capture and local taxation, because once you get planning permission on a land, and a developer knows this, it increases by minimum of 500% in value, just for, you know, having planning permission on it to build houses. So we all know how much money there is in land. It's the foundation of our housing system. And if we allow the planning system to be totally bulldozed, then we risk losing kind of any tiny aspects that we claw back through the existing systems, which already need strengthening. Next slide, please, Domi. So yeah, just I've touched on this already, but it's always worth slightly nerdy, but getting into a bit of why the planning system, which is quite possibly one of the least sexy aspects of working in housing research, but it is something that we have to defend. The 1947 Act was such a key moment of democratization for this country. A well-designed and well-funded planning system really is the heart of our democracy. It allows communities to have a say in what happens to their local area. It allows us to prioritize public good over profit. the planning system and the need for planning reform has its roots in the enclosure movement and in colonialism. I mean, if that doesn't tell you kind of key aspects about why the planning system is important in, you know, in the context of mass land grabs and the wealthiest being able to quite literally steal the land and enclose it from communities. And that's never spoken about in these conversations around planning. It's always about red tape and it being a problem for people. And it's not. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm incredibly, inherently critical of the existing planning system, but for different reasons. Often community engagement is an afterthought or a tick box exercise. They're the bits we need to strengthen, not overhauling it. And I think as well, it's really worth thinking about that a strong and publicly accountable planning system that is linked to our industrial strategy helps us find our way through the pressures of trade-offs that are inherent to land use decisions. You know, a lot of the time we talk about, like, you don't want a piece of land to be empty, but if moving a piece of land out of public ownership, for example, into community ownership happens, there's a trade-off there, and we need to find a way to work through that. There's a trade-off of putting, you know, surgeries or services on land. There's a trade-off between bringing in new industries and jobs, but that trade-off is losing land. And without a strongly accountable public planning system, those trade-offs won't be decided by us. And it's a dangerous moment for our democracy, I would argue. Next slide, please, Tommy. Okay, just very quickly on kind of the evolution of YIMBYism in the UK, for those of you that maybe have more of a life than me and don't follow this so closely. As I've said, we've got significant people in significant control in government and decision-making spaces have come out and said that they are YIMBYs. And arguably part of this is around vote grabs and appealing to certain markets, but we shouldn't just dismiss it as that, because they're making important decisions right now. And these decisions will stay with us for our lifetime and our children's and nephews and nieces' lifetimes. Rachel Reeves herself said that planning is the single greatest obstacle in our economic success. So they're very, very closely linking it to their growth agenda. I would say more on a personal level, they're very loud, prominently online, historically overwhelmingly male voices that exercise their anger to any opposition very publicly. If anyone has time on their hands and wants to kind of go online, whether it's on like Twitter or Blue Sky or kind of Reddit pages, and type in NIMBY and YIMBY, you will see how quickly the proponents of mass house building can try and eviscerate people that even suggest opposition to that. I've been at the sharp end of that, and it's not a nice movement in that sense. There's huge opposition to our organised tenant and community movements that, of course, have gained quite a lot of groundswell recently. But there's kind of quite a lot of, let's call it, distasteful politics going on there linked to that. The organised tenants and residents movement is quite a threat to mass developers and house builders, right? Because we're the people that hold them to account on the types of houses they build, how much they charge for them, whether or not the front door falls off within 10 minutes because they used, you know, dodgy fittings. We're the ones that hold them to account on that, not the government. So we, of course, you know, we pose quite a significant threat to them. And also a really interesting development I've seen recently as someone that was in NEF quite alone in my accusation of being called a NIMBY, is this NIMBY narrative has expanded massively. If anyone's been following the Heathrow Airport expansion debate, which is around the fact that if we expand Heathrow Airport, it will shatter our carbon targets and be really problematic. Anyone that's pointing that out now is part of the NIMBY movement and is totally ostracized for that. So the kind of the arguably false binary between YIMBY and NIMBY is spreading out of the housing movement elsewhere. And people are constantly being kind of framed as blockers and problematic for that. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to fly on. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, I mentioned at the start the way in which I frame it in my head, which is around a point of division and also a distraction. Of course, we know that the ultimate enemy is the super wealthy, the developers, the power holders. But what we see in this debate is that renters are divided between those that want immediate house building because they believe it will kind of build affordable housing, and those, as I said, raising legitimate questions who are ostracized as blockers. This division plays into the hands of the people that hold power, right? And even though I might see opposition to someone that believes that building 1 million houses tomorrow will solve everything, technically in the long term, we are on the same side materially if we're thinking about ourselves relative to the institutional developers, for example. But this debate really polarizes us and sees us pitted against each other. And I would also argue that it creates a significant distraction. Whilst we're arguing amongst ourselves, we aren't asking the critical questions of the who, the what, the wheres of housing, right, as I've spoken about. And it's important to kind of remember that in how we build our case. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, very quickly, this is not necessarily an exercise for now, but something that I hope to do in another session around researching private companies and thinking about how we can use our tools. I've used the term developer activist. This is not me being tongue-in-cheek. This is how some huge institutional developers have described themselves to me, and many others. And as with any issue under capitalism, as with anything I do, it's all about following the money will lead to answers. It's always useful to ask ourselves the basic questions that seem basic to us, but they're not. Why is it that developers want to build these houses? Of course, they get a minimum in this country of 15% profit, right, from any houses they build. It leads up to higher. Why have developers suddenly become the YIMBY activists? Why are they funding their events? What do they get out of it? Is it that they've suddenly developed a conscience about the housing crisis? I'm not going to answer that question because I'm being recorded. But what we've been doing a lot of, and I do a lot of my work, is as part of our campaigning, if we see kind of YIMBY style events advertised, always look at like who the sponsors are, who are the funders. Highly likely to be a house building company or someone with a vested, predominantly profit-based interest. And I'd really like to take this, if there's interest, to look more as a collective about how we use our research methods that we have to our disposal to work out kind of how we blast that open, because it's really important in terms of democratic accountability and tracing those flows of money. And there's easy ways to do it using online resources. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, so just kind of to launch us before we get into discussion, a bit of framing. I think it's worth saying, I hope it would go without saying, but a rejection of YIMBYism does not mean a rejection of homes and house building. We want to see houses, but we want to see them as homes, not new opportunities for upward wealth distribution. And I think really for me is the fact that it diverts us from the genuine solutions that we've really pushed from the left into public debate in recent years. Conversations around rent controls or any form of caps, I never thought we'd get there. I mean, even in my lifetime, to be fair, maybe that's because I'm a cynic. But rent controls, major social housing programs, reversing austerity that have absolutely severed our public services, and things like reacquisition of social stock. You know, it's important, in my opinion, for us to have a case against this, for us to be able to myth bust them, for us to be able to break through it, but to also ensure that it's one of our tools at our disposal and it's not distracting us from larger, more prevalent issues that we need to be campaigning on and supporting. So I think the reason why we wanted to do this session was to have it as a tool that people can pick up on, because it can be quite a intimidating environment, particularly when economists start shouting about supply and demand at you, but learning those kind of key reasons as to why those debates aren't necessarily as realistic as they say, and then really focusing on how we can push forward.